What's up, guys? We're going to upgrade the Eachine TYRO79 and the Pro Edition today with an ultimate flight controller. I'm going to show you how to build it coming up next.
Hey guys, I'm Rebecca. You have a chance to win this DJI FPV drone, the case, and 2 batteries. We're gonna choose one of the next 100,000 subscribers to be our lucky winner. So please subscribe, good luck, and happy FPV.
Welcome to today's video, guys. If you do enjoy the Drone Camps channel, be sure to check me out on my Patreon. It's patreon.com/dronecamps. You can sponsor the channel for a minimum amount of money per month. If you're learning something on here and you love FPV, please do sponsor Drone Camps because it is a huge asset to the drone community. Let's go ahead and get started with upgrading the Eachine TYRO79 and the Pro Edition. Now, to really bring this drone up to speed, we're going to use the Diatone Mamba stack. This is the MK4 F722 flight controller with 40 amp ESCs. It can run 3 to 6S on here, even though these motors are not rated for 6S. We're going to run it on 4S today, but I'm going to walk you through the installation of this board and this ESC set below it. We're going to install it in this frame, and we're going to have an ultimate upgrade on this Tyro. So if you want to order this stack right here, I will put the link in the video description. You can follow along with this video and upgrade your TYRO79. Let's go ahead and get started with soldering up the ESCs. Now at this point, I'm assuming you have your soldering iron ready to go. You have your pair of snips. You have a small pair of needle nose pliers, you have your M2 driver, and your 6040 solder are ready to go. You can check out the links in the video description if you need to get any of these tools. I have them all listed in the video. So the first thing you need to do before you start with any build, guys, is always check out the schematic. This is the ESC schematic that came along with the F722 Mini, and it shows me my layout for my motors. So if this is the very rear of the quad right here, right turn motor right here is motor number 1, motor number 2, motor number 3, and motor number 4. And what we're going to do is start up, we're going to tin all of these pads right here on both sides and in the back for the battery wire. So we're going to start out with motor number 1, and we're not going to solder any wires on just yet. We're going to tin up these, and once we have it all nicely tinned up, we'll move on to the next part, which is putting on the motor wires, the battery wires, and the capacitor on top of the battery cable. Now you can either do this step right now, or you can go ahead and solder up the tabs first, and then you can add these later. These have to go through these holes here, these 4 holes. These are the 20 by 20 mounts for your TYRO79. And I'm going to leave that up to you. But I wanted to give you a tip really quick. Putting these in can be kind of a pain for new guys, and I always really kind of have to take my time here. So the way I get these through is I put it on an angle like this, and then I just take my M2 driver and I slowly work my way around just by lightly pushing through and pushing part of it down one piece at a time, and I just kind of work my way all the way around, and then eventually I get to that last part and push it through, and it just kind of pops through just like that. And you're going to do the other 2. Now we're going to solder up the tabs and get those all tinned for the wires. So now we're going to start out with the first 3, and this is motor number 1. It is labeled on the top, number 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can use a magnifying glass if you can't see, but go ahead and heat up your iron to about 350 degrees Celsius there. 350 on your iron. It's pretty hot, so we're going to grab our 6040 solder here, and I really should have a set of helping hands. I'll put a link down below for those, and you can definitely hold your flight controller still with a set of helping hands. It really helps out in your build. So unfortunately today, where I'm working from, I don't have a set of them, and if you don't know what helping hands is, it just is a pair of little tiny clips that comes in on an arm, and you can clip it to your ESC or your flight controller, and you can just hold it in spot. So normally what I do is I put one arm up top here and here where these standoffs are, or the grommets. These are blue grommets. And now move your pin around on the tab, spread the solder around, evenly distribute the heat, and once you see it nice and shiny, on each ESC tab should be nice and shiny. If you see any bridging solder coming from one pad to the next, that means that you need to use your solder sucker, suck the solder off, maybe used a little bit too much solder, and then you want to see some separation in between those pads. If any of these pads bridge solder, meaning two of the pads connect, when you plug in a battery, it will it'll have a puff of white smoke. So you want to be very careful there. You don't want to burn up your ESC stack on your first go round. And at this point, you just want to keep going all the way around. And if you get a little too much solder on your tip, go ahead and clean it off, start over and come back. And just kind of touch your solder down to the tab. I always kind of rotate my pen tip around in a sort of counterclockwise fashion. And I'm just adding solder as I go here. And once you get all the way around, you're going to do the big battery terminal tabs in the very back of the ESC stack. And we're moving right along. And really, you don't have to hold it on there very long, guys. So tip for the new guys is not to press down too hard on these tabs when you're doing this, because you can't separate the tab from the ESCs. If that happens, the ESC is trashed. You won't be able to put this gold tab back on this ESC stack. I've seen guys do that in the past. So now at this point, this is going to take a little longer to get these. And what we really want to do here is just kind of make sure we have a good amount on there, be liberal with the amount of 60-40 solder you're putting down. So it kind of puffs up into a kind of a little bubble. Make sure that you're spreading your pen tip around to evenly distribute the heat. You want this pad to heat up, and then just pull away from the ESC stack when you think you're done. So at that point, we have all the tabs soldered up, and we can go ahead and start soldering the wires on. Now, two things about the standoffs that are going to go up through here. First things first, you want to go ahead and make sure you have all your grommets here. And the second thing is that we're going to have two different size posts in the pack. For this build, we're going to use the shorter posts. So go ahead and take all the longer ones and set them to the side. We're going to use the shorter ones, just going to work out better. So go ahead and grab one of your standoffs here. This is going to be your new standoff. We're going to get rid of those old plastic ones, and we're just going to run this bolt right through the bottom. And we're going to put this standoff here. And you're going to put two more on using those shorter style bolts. And we're just going to put this one through here. And it's important to pay attention to the orientation of your motors. And for right now, I left the props on here. And this is just to kind of show you orientation. So we're going to do right turn rear here. And this is motor number 1. So motor number 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to take a couple more standoffs. And this is just going to keep the ESCs off the bottom of the quad's frame. So that's very important. We can pull these through and make them tight in a minute. Now we want to go ahead and put this ESC stack right on top of these 4 bolts and push it all the way down. And you can use a standoff. You can use one of the nuts to secure it while you're soldering up your wires, but at this point, once we have it down, we're going to go ahead and start soldering up the wires. Now we're going to go ahead and solder down wires for the motor number 1, but before you get started, as always in any build, you want to make sure you take your props off. Don't do like I did here in the video. I'm just leaving them on because I'm lazy. And also, these are kind of hard to tighten down. This style motor will require a lot of holding this motor bell while you're cranking down this prop nut right here. They're a real pain in the butt to get down. They do make some motor wrenches with some rubber grommets on there that you can hold the motor and hold it as tight as you can and crank down that nut. The 3-inch motors tend to be a pain, much harder than the 5-inch to put on. So with these 3 wires, I recommend that you use a type of tweezers here. And someone asked me on the channel this week, or last week's build, they asked me why did I leave the length on the motor wires. Well, I said sometimes we put them on a different quad, or we poach motors and we reuse them. In other instances, this instance, the ESC tabs are on this side. On the TYRO79 Pro AIO, they're on the back side, so now they've moved the tabs over here to this side for this stack, so I need actually a little more length. So if I had to cut them to fit here, I wouldn't have enough to length to meet this new stack. So leave the motor wires the length that they are when you build your TYRO79. That way later, if you do an upgrade, you'll have enough wire to reach the new ESC tabs. So now if you keep your solder close by, you can just kind of reach over and take a little bit of solder here. Clean off your tip and hit it one more time. And go ahead and take your tweezers, and we're going to put down wire number 1. And this is for motor number 1, right turn rear here. I always say right turn rear on the channel so you guys can remember that sort of standard quad setup that gets you started on your prop orientation. So that wire is done, and when you're done with the solder for a motor wire, you can just pull back away from the ESCs and you'll get a nice clean solder. So I usually kind of heat up the wire first, and then I drop it into the tab and then pull back. It only takes a second, guys. A couple seconds and you are good. So that wire doesn't seem to want to reach, so it's a little tight there, so I want to have a little more room there. So I'm just going to use this wire and I'm going to move it over. So I'm going to go ahead and move this one to the next. Okay, I'm going to pull away. Just look a little closer there, make sure I'm not bridging any solder to the neighboring pad. Very important that we don't connect any solder from one tab to the other. You want to take a very close look at that, especially before you plug in your battery. So motor number 1 is now done. We can move on to motor number 2. Do those 3 wires, motor number 3 and 4. Now I have motor number 2 done. I'm going to move on to motor number 3. And now when you're doing this, guys, try to move the other wires out of the way. They seem to be pesky and they try to get right in your way a lot of the times. So now we have the first wire on motor number 3. Now we're going to take wire number 2, a little more solder, clean your tip off, a little more solder again, a tiny amount of solder on the tip. You don't need a lot because these are pre-tinned. You should also pre-tin the wire tips, because sometimes the solder that comes from the factory is not so great, so I usually like to add some solder from my own collection down to whatever build I'm doing, because usually the solder from the factories that are just put on there, it's just cheap solder, so go ahead and add some extra solder to your wires. And now motor number 3 is done. We're going to move on to motor number 4. Okay, so I'm going to grab a little more solder here, clean the tip again, use a little more solder, and I'm going to come in here, hold that wire down to the tab, heating up the wire first, kind of spreading it around a little bit. Once I feel it melt, I'm going to pull back. Just give that wire a tug when you're done. And don't pull too soon on the wire with the tweezers, because sometimes it'll come off the tab. It just hasn't seated itself yet. This time we're going to get a little more solder, clean the tip, get a little tiny tab again, come back in here, heat that wire up first, and then we're going to drop into the tab, pull back away from the ESCs, and you should have a nice clean solder. And just double check and inspect those tabs over and over, guys, to make sure that you don't have any bridges. You don't want this solder to bridge back over. So you can also use flux in this equation as well, and it'll make the solder adhere down to the metal quite a bit better. But we're in a hurry in this video, and I'm not using flux. So all these solder points look really good now. And we can move on to putting the standoffs on for putting the flight controller just above. So grab one of your standoffs, grab another one, put those on the posts, and we want 4 of those rubber standoffs on this setup. And then we're going to put the harness coming from the ESCs up to the flight controller. But before we do that, we're going to solder on our XT30 battery wire and the capacitor. Now at this point, I really wish I had my helping hands to hold the quad still for the installation of this. Would just make this much easier and probably burning my fingers a little bit less here. This larger gauge wire gets pretty hot, but when you're installing these battery wires, no matter what wire you're using, you want to make sure that you heat up the wire first. And once it's nice and hot, go ahead and put it down to the tab. If you heat up the wire and the tab together, sometimes you can have a problem where the pad will separate, the pad got too much heat, and then you have a huge problem. So you don't want this pad to separate from the ESC stack. So now once it feels nice and hot, it liquefies, I'm going to pull back and away from it. And that looks okay. I'm going to add some more solder to that though. We're going to come in here and we're just going to tin up this next positive wire here. Quite good. We're going to get it nice and hot. And when you put solder down to a wire, the solder helps spread the heat around. So just a tip for you new guys. And this one's going to go a lot quicker. I have more solder on there. That looks nice and good. So I'm going to add a little more solder to this negative side over here. And you can redo things if you don't like the way it looks. If it looks a little bit messy, just redo it, pull the wire off and go back in. But remember not to get too much heat there. And now we're going to pull away. And that looks a lot better. So now we can add on the capacitor. Now for this capacitor installation, this is the old one and this is the new one. You'll notice that on the side here, this one's marked with a negative, which is ground, and this one has it the opposite. It has a red sort of print on this side, so that's going to be your positive side. So what you're going to do is use this one for this particular stack, a set of ESC. So we're going to clean off the tip, and we're going to come in here, and we're just going to tin these wires a tiny bit with a little bit of solder, just get them prepped up and nice and warm. And you don't want to inverse polarity this. This will be a big problem if you did this inverse polarity here, because I've done that with these capacitors before and they actually explode when you plug in a battery, so it will surprise you. They just give it kind of a big pop, and it's quite alarming. So I'm going to add a little bit of solder there, come in and just gently come in here and heat that up so we have a little bit of wet solder and let it dry. And now the capacitor is soldered on to the battery terminal. You can take a piece of heat shrink and come back over that and secure that capacitor a little bit better. I do recommend that. Now if you're at this point in the video, congratulations, you have soldered up your TYRO79 ESC upgrade. Now we're moving on to the flight controllers. So go ahead and put 4 grommets on each corner. These are much easier. Grab your harness, put it in here. Make sure you pay attention to which way the pins face. For this particular setup here, we're going to go ahead and put the wire harness there. It looks like they are pins down across this rail, so I'm going to flip those this direction, pins down, and we're going to go ahead and plug those in. And we're going to see if we have enough room to kind of like tuck those wires from that harness up underneath. And you want to make sure that when you put this on, that it is facing forward. There's a little arrow, and it doesn't appear that it's long enough to really tuck it too much. But we're just going to kind of tuck it under there with our thumb, and then we're going to put it on top. And if it doesn't go down all the way, just bring that harness out. So we're not going to tuck it, and then we're going to put it down right on here. So if this is a little bit tall, which it appears to be, and you're having a problem getting a nut on top of this stack right here, what we're going to do is trim down these posts a little bit. So we're going to make these grommets that we put on top here just a little bit shorter each one by about, say, 1 millimeter or so. It's really about all I needed. So I'm just going to trim that off with my snips and set it back on there. And you want your flight controller to be fairly level when you tighten it down. So that's just going to give us a little more room because we do have a grommet. And you're going to do that for each one. And your flight controller should be sitting absolutely level once you put your nuts on top, okay? And these are probably going to be a little bit different lengths, but we're going to try to do the best we can here for those. Make sure they're a little bit shorter so we have clearance for the nuts. Okay. Just a little off the top. And I've done stuff like this before. And in this build, it's not surprising me that we need to do that. So this one a little bit shorter. And at this point, you can go ahead and we're going to set that flight controller in. And we're going to start soldering up our camera and VTX next. So there's the last one. Make sure the arrow faces forward. This is your right turn rear right here. And at this point, go ahead and put it down, kind of push it down a little bit. Tuck that wire under. And this looks like a little more room, just enough room. If you need a little more space there, you can always trim them down a little bit further, but you don't want to make any contact with that lower set of ESCs. That's looking pretty good. Now at this point in the build, guys, we're going to kind of check out our stack and how much room we have with this carbon frame. So for this build, I put this side rail on top of the carbon frame, not underneath it. So I ran a bolt up through the bottom. This is a threaded side plate here. So we have quite a bit of room here still, but the way this is made, it's kind of made to be fancy and built up around the flight controller. The cool thing about this is that these are really thin pieces of carbon here. If we choose to have more room here, we can take a pair of snips and we can snip off this one here and this one here. So this will give us just more room, and we could also snip here and just completely remove this fancy little piece that's sticking out right here, allowing us to get the VTX right above here. Now to do that, we can use the longer screw. So all you have to do is pull out one of these original bolts that we put through and put the longer one through there. And then if you trim these off, you can fit this VTX on the very top of this stack. So we'll have a 3-up stack. So 1, 2, 3 in this stack, all the way close to the top of that frame. Or you can take it and you can make the wires come above this frame, and you can have the VTX sitting up here. Some people have done that on previous builds, but for this one, I'm going to try to put this in the stack. So I'm going to trim off this side here, this part here, and this part right here, and that's just going to give me tons more room. And I'm also going to use the longer bolt. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out the short bolt, and again, if you need to snip off a bolt, you can do that as well. So I'm going to grab a longer bolt now, and you'll see that it gives me room now to be able to install the VTX just above the flight controller. But I'm going to snip off this carbon frame, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now, whenever you're working or cutting on any kind of carbon, it's a good idea to wear safety glasses. It's also a good idea to take it outside if you're using a Dremel tool, because it will create carbon dust, which can get in your eyes. And guess what? Carbon never goes away. So carbon dust in your eyes is a big problem. So I'm just going to be Conan here, Conan the Barbarian, and I'm just going to go ahead and kind of just close my eyes and snip there on that piece. I'm going to close my eyes again and snip on this. It's not going to make the cleanest cuts in the world, but it's going to allow me to move on with this build for you guys. So I'm going to get close to the top as I can here, close my eyes, snip again, and now I have much more room on this side. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side as well. And we're going to move on with this build. We're going to do the same thing on the other side plate. So snip, 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 1, 2, 3 snips on each of those. And this is going to really open this frame up. This is really not so much for frame strength as it is decoration. The last snip there, boom. We are ready for a full stack installation. Now that we have the flight controller nice and level, it is seated on top of the ESCs, we can go ahead and do kind of a retrofit here. We've also trimmed out this carbon side rail. The first one, just to see where things are, we've added all of the longer bolts at this point. Now we exchange those out from the shorter ones because I decided I wanted to put the VTX here on top of the stack instead of putting it on the outside of the quad. It would make it better for crashes for you. So I want the most durability for you guys. So go ahead and grab your VTX at this point. You have your prop nuts on top here, and we can just kind of retrofit this, and we're going to put this harness facing forward here. Go ahead and drop it down. You just want to look at things to make sure that we have plenty of clearance here, no chips from the bottom or touching the VTX anywhere, and it looks good from the side. And what you're going to do now is go ahead and take that side plate that you cut and trimmed, And we're just going to kind of retrofit here. We're going to look to see that we have plenty of clearance there between the top of the frame. So we have a little bit of the bolt sticking out there. We have just enough to get another plastic standoff on the top of that bolt. Do you want to make your TV full screen or your phone full screen, or you want to zoom in and look at that clearance? We have about 3 millimeters of clearance to the top of that carbon frame. So plenty of room for this 3-layer stack. So congratulations for making it this far in the build and the upgrade of your TYRO79 or the Pro version. Go ahead and grab your Mamba schematic. We're going to go ahead and go through this. One other note before we get started with the next step of this build is if you want to take your side plate, your carbon plate that you trimmed back, you can kind of see that there's some rough edges on mine. I was a little bit Conan the Barbarian and I just kind of haphazardly snipped those off with a pair of snips. If you want to come back with a piece of medium grade type of sandpaper, go outside, wear a regulator, goggles, and make sure you don't get any of this dust in your lungs or in your eyes because it'll stay there forever. Very important that you protect yourself from carbon dust. Very dangerous stuff, but once you have this nice and pretty, you can go ahead and install it on top of your drone and we can do the rest of this build, or you can just leave it like this, but you can get carbon splinters from these, so you want to be super careful with any kind of type of carbon that you cut, and recommend again doing that type of cutting outside so you don't have carbon splinters. But the first thing we're going to install is the VTX, and once we install that, we're just going to leave it hanging off the back, but we're going to get started with the power wires and then move on to the signal wire on the very back of this flight controller. Now, if you're using the VTX that came along with the Tyro, we can solder that up to the 9-volt over here on the far left right here. So we're going to go ahead and tin that up. This VTX will run from around 7-volt all the way up to about 20-some volt on the back here it says. So 24-volt to be exact. So we're going to tin that one up right there. Be careful if you've got a little solder over on the next pad over. You want to make sure that that does not bridge. Go ahead and take your first power wire and you can just hold it down there. And we're going to lightly touch on top of the wire and we're going to pull back and we're on there. So the next one is going to be the ground, which is the neighboring tab. And we already have a little bit of 60-40 solder on there, so we're just going to lightly tin that. We're going to pull away. And again, make double, triple sure that you don't have any bridging solder from one tab to the next. So now that we have the ground wire down, we'll move on to the signal wire. So press down lightly and pull back and away and just double, triple check. Use a magnifying glass if you need to. Make sure there's absolutely no solder touching the next neighbor over. So we're going to look for the VTX tab, and the VTX tab on this schematic is just one tab over from TX3. So we're going to skip a tab there and go over one to the right, and we're just going to tin that up, pull away from the flight controller. Once you have a little solder there, we're going to make sure this wire is nice and flat on that tab. You guys are doing great. Pat yourself on the back if you made it this far. So now we're going to pull back away from the flight controller on the release, and now we've installed the VTX. And we should have enough wire to be able to tuck it back and under and still have our UFL connector in the very back of this VTX setup. That's looking good. Now we're going to install your S-Bus receiver. So if you're installing Crossfire, you're going to use RX1 and TX1 on this schematic right here. If you're using S-Bus, we're going to do 5-volt ground and RX1. So this top rail on the inside, don't worry about that. It says SCL, SDA. That's actually for adding GPS if you want to on this flight controller. So later on, if you wanted to have GPS on your Tyro, you could do that. If you're using a Spectrum receiver, you can power it from the 3.3 volt tab, which is all the way to the front of the quad here on the left-hand side of this rail. So we just spun the quad around about 90 degrees there, and we're going to go ahead and move one tab over, and we're just going to put some solder down there. We're going to tin that one up. We're going to go one more over. That is our 5-volt tab, or that is the ground tab, excuse me. And then this last one here was RX1. So you should have these three down. And there should be no solder touching any neighboring tab. Be very careful there. So now go ahead and grab your S-Bus receiver, and we're going to start out with the 5-volt cable. So that's usually the red one. And we're going to go ahead and put some heat to it, push down a little bit, pull away, and try to hold that wire as still as possible. You can do it over if you think it wasn't good. I'm on a little bit of an angle there, but that's okay. So now we have the ground wire, and we're going to push down there. Looking back at my schematic to make double, triple check that that's the right tab. And again, if you get something wrong, you can just unsolder it and do it over. And I have, soldered up receivers backwards before, and since they're such low voltage, I didn't have damage, luckily. And if the wire is kind of hard to hold on to, again, I recommend using a pair of tweezers, and I don't see mine anywhere, so they have run off the bench. I'm just going to try to do this with my finger here. Found them. So we're going to go ahead and put this wire down and straighten out that wire. It's kind of crooked a little bit. You just want to make sure everything is straight here. You don't want anything running off the tab. So I'm going to push down and away. And now we have the signal wire on there. So we have 5-volt ground and RX1 on that rail, just like you see on the schematic. And now you've installed your receiver. You guys are doing really good in this build. So again, pat yourself on the back. Building a quad can be fun if you really just take your time and make sure things are nice, because the last thing you want is kind of messy soldering. And messy soldering leads to wires popping off and things like that. So the next part of this build, we're going to go ahead and do the camera. So we're not going to solder to the VCC tab there. We're going to do 5-volt ground and camera. So from the far left-hand side, we're going to skip one tab and move one tab over. So we're just going to take a little piece of solder here. And I just trimmed off a piece so that I could work a little easier here. And it only takes a moment. Just spread that around on the tab, distribute the heat. And then we're going to go do the third one over. Now we have those tabs all soldered up and they are pre-tinned. If you feel like you had a little too much solder on one tab, like I see this middle one here, I'm just going to pull off a little bit of solder by cleaning my tip. If you don't have a solder sucker to use to remove some solder, you can kind of do this. It's just like removing a little bit of paint from an easel. There we go. Those look nice. Now we can add on the wires. So the first wire we're going to add on is the 5-volt wire. Just going to use my tweezers and come in and add a little bit of heat, pull away from the flight controller, and we're good there. Now we can do the ground wire. Just going to pull that up. And it's a good idea to have these wires trimmed back as short as possible where it's going to make a connection down to the tab. You don't want stuff kind of hanging out. And if you need a little more solder on the pin tip, if it's a little bit dry, just go ahead and add a tiny amount of solder to your pin tip, which I'm going to do now. Just the tiniest amount for these small tabs. Don't need much, okay? Now we're going to do the video wire. This is for the camera signal. And it's going to go straight through the flight controller to the VTX tab and back to your goggles. And that's a little bit crooked, but I might be able to live with that. I'm a perfectionist when it comes to getting my wires straight. Okay, that's going to be good enough. And now we have installed the VTX, the receiver, and the camera. So you are doing really, really good today if you got to this point in the upgrade process. I have to give it to you. You've done some modding on your carbon frame, you installed your ESCs, you installed the stack, the flight controller, you soldered up your VTX, your receiver, and your camera. So again, hopefully you have your props off. Unlike me, I'm being lazy today. But at this point, we can start to go ahead and install the side plates. And we're going to start out with this one first, and we're going to put it on top of the stack and run the screw through the bottom up into the side plate. So, and then we're going to start retrofitting where the ESC is going to go. We're going to take the VTX, and these wires are coated in plastic, which I really loathe because that makes them a little bit brittle. If they were silicone, they'd be so much nicer. Now we're going to go ahead and slide this on, and you're going to go ahead and grab some little plastic stack nut and just put it over top of the VTX. I have a few over here. We're just going to grab from the Mamba stack. They give us some extra ones, so I'm just going to put 2 on top of this VTX stack. It'll save me a little bit of time. You really don't need 4 on top of the VTX, but I'm going to leave that up to you. And once you install these on top of the stack, this is your last set of hardware that you're going to put on here. Go ahead and inspect your stack top to bottom to make sure that nothing's really touching. One tip is that they do have a piece of paper between this USB-C port and where this might come up and touch. So you should be okay there, but before you plug anything in, you want to always make sure that you use a smoke stopper. So they make an XT30 version of that. So when you plug in a battery, if the light turns on, that means you have something touching somewhere that this doesn't like, and it will smoke if you didn't have it. So it's very important to use a smoke stopper before you plug in your quad for the first time. Now I have my 2 bolts for the side plate screwed in, and I'm going to go ahead and install the first M2 screw into my camera. And when you're installing these sidewalls, it's important to make sure that you have that front divot sort of facing in on both sides. I talked about that in the Tyro build before. There's just a little bit of a divot here, barely noticeable, but that's going to allow your camera to move up and down, and that will be the correct position that this needs to be. We also have enough room in here for putting our receiver on top of the VTX right there. Now I have this other side rail on with the next 2 bolts and the final bolt here for the camera. Just go ahead and nice and snug there. Don't over tighten your bolts in any of your FPV builds. So now everything fits in here nicely. We can also grab that last carbon plate that goes on the top right here. I recommend before you put that on to go ahead and bind up and set up your receiver. And again, before you plug anything in, make sure that you use a smoke stopper before you do that. So very important for this build. Otherwise you might have a short. And if you're a brand new builder, chances are you have a short somewhere. It just happens to me all the time. And you know what? After 10 years of building drones and FPV quads, I still get shorts from time to time. So I'm only going to add 2 bolts on this top plate. But now it's ready to bind up to my TX16S Max. And it is ready for some serious freestyle FPV. Now we have a 3-layer stack in here with the same VTX but upgraded ESCs to 40 amp and an F7 flight controller. So if you put some different props on here, I'll recommend some props down below that'll be way better for the TYRO79, and I'll put all the links down below for all the items that I used in this build process. I'm also going to try to find what we used to call a Mr. Jig. This is just kind of a helping hands for any type of XT30 or XT60 installations. This is a great little helper. Banggood used to have these, but I'm not sure if they do anymore, but it just holds it in place while you solder in your wires. So that's a process that you're going to have to take some time on. And again, fill up these holes here, heat up the wire first, and then heat up the posts and drop it into the post before you do that. Sometimes it helps also to plug in the other side here so that you don't have this plastic casings start to melt and this will start to move, and that's a big problem. Then you'll have a distorted plug. So I've done that before and I had to throw away the XT60. So be careful there. And now you guys are all done with these mods and upgrades, and if you're brand new to the hobby, share this video with another guy and get them into the sport as well, because FPV is like so much fun. It's been my life for 10 years and I'm still giving back to the community. So hopefully this helped you turn your TYRO79 or your Pro model into a much, much better FPV freestyle racing drone. So huge upgrades here on the channel today. You can check out the links and grab one of the MK4 Mamba stacks. I highly recommend it for the TYRO79. It's well worth the upgrade and the time. Guys, take care. I'm Justin Davis. Please do subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.